My name is Michael Harwood, and I can still hear the sound the wine glass made when my father tapped it with his ring that night. It was sharp, clean, the kind of sound that slices through laughter and silverware and sets a table of people on edge without knowing why. The dining room was glowing in golden light from the chandelier, and the oak table that had been in our family for 3 generations groaned under the weight of roast lamb, garlic potatoes, and enough expensive wine to make anyone forget about politics or grudges. Unless you were my father, who remembered everything. We were all there. My mother in pearls and silence. My brother Danny, grinning too wide, chewing too slow. My cousins, uncles, aunts, spouses, kids, 15 people who were part of the Harwood legacy. A legacy built on timber, on sweat, on trees that outlived the men who felled them. And at the head of the table sat the king of the forest, my father, Charles Harwood. A man who shook hands like he was breaking a contract and spoke with the tone of someone who always had the last word. I was 32 and had given 10 years of my life to Harwood Timber, the family business. I'd studied finance and supply chain logistics, shadowed operations from Oregon to Vermont, streamlined processes, cut costs, saved millions. I'd made sacrifices, lost a fiancé to long nights, lost weekends to spreadsheets. But I was supposed to be next. I knew I was. Everyone knew I was. Until he tapped that wine glass. "Thank you all for coming tonight," my father said, smiling like a senator announcing a tax hike. "I know family dinners aren't always easy to arrange these days, but I wanted you here for a reason." I felt my mother's eyes glance at me and quickly away. I remember that. That's the moment I should have known. "As you all know, I've been preparing my succession plan for Harwood Timber," he continued, and I sat a little straighter in my chair, adjusting the cuff of my shirt like it mattered. "And after much thought, years of thought, really, I've made a final decision." He smiled at Danny, who raised his eyebrows like a boy about to get a new car. I blinked. A strange tightness pulled across my chest. "Danny will be taking over Harwood Timber when I step down," my father said, lifting his glass. "He'll begin shadowing me immediately to prepare for the role. I believe he has the right instincts and temperament for modern leadership. Michael will continue in his current position as VP, of course, and we expect him to support the transition fully." Silence. Actual, sharp silence. Someone's fork dropped against a plate, and no one moved. My hand went cold around my glass. Danny was still chewing, pretending to be surprised, nodding like he'd just been asked to join a school committee. My mother stared into her lap. I laughed. I didn't mean to, but I laughed. A short, bitter sound that cracked the silence. "You can't be serious," I said. My father blinked at me. "Excuse me. He doesn't even work at the company," I said, my voice louder now. "He hasn't worked a full-time job in 5 years. He has no experience, no qualifications. He shows up at the office once a month for free lunch." "Michael," my mother whispered. Don't. I looked at her. "He's giving away my life's work like a door prize, and you want me to sit here and clap?" My father stood up. "That's enough." "No," I said. "Not this time." "You're being emotional," he said. "And you're being a coward," I replied. The words slipped out, clean and clear. Every head turned. "You're throwing away the company. You're handing it to a screw-up because he's easier to control." My father leaned across the table. "Watch your tone, Michael. You're not entitled to anything." 10 years, I said. 10 years, and I never asked for anything. Not a raise, not a title. I stayed. I built the systems that saved us during the recession. I kept us solvent when half our competitors shut down. And now you're cutting me out." He smiled, and that was worse than anything. "You were never going to be CEO," he said. "You're too angry, too proud, too much like me." I stood up, pushed my chair back, and looked around the table. No one met my eyes. Not even Danny, who was suddenly fascinated by his wine glass. "You'll regret this," I said. My voice didn't shake. I didn't yell. I just made a promise. My father raised his glass. "Tonight's not about regrets. It's about the future." I walked out, drove home in silence. Didn't turn on the radio. Didn't cry. Just sat on my couch in the dark, staring at the floor, replaying every decision I'd made in the past decade. I could have left. Could have joined a competitor. Could have built something on my own. But I didn't, because I believed. I believed in loyalty, in legacy, in blood. That night, I poured myself one drink and made a plan. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to fight for scraps. I was going to take everything. And I was going to make sure my father knew what it felt like to be powerless, to be humiliated, to watch everything he built be taken by the one son he said wasn't worthy. I started at dawn. No sleep, no mercy, just strategy and revenge. It started with a spreadsheet and a silence so loud it pressed against my ribs like a fist, and that silence lived with me for weeks as I built the blueprint of my revenge with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a monk. Because if my father was going to bury me alive, then I would rise from that grave and pull him down with me, one calculated step at a time. And so I began not with fire but with shadows. Because empires aren't destroyed by explosions, they're undone from the inside, rotted slowly, cell by cell, until they collapse under their own arrogance. And that's exactly what I planned to do to Harwood Timber, to the man who founded it, and to the son he thought deserved it more than me. So I disappeared into my office, showed up every day on time, worked late, smiled in meetings, congratulated Danny on his promotion like a dutiful lieutenant, all while watching, collecting, noting every weakness, every oversight, every conversation that should have stayed behind closed doors. And while Danny tried to play boss with his cheap suits and rehearsed charm, I spent my nights building something else entirely, something he wouldn't see until it was far too late. I created a shell company registered under a silent partnership in Nevada, then funneled it through a foreign trust held in Singapore. Legal, clean, untraceable, and I named it Ironwood Consulting, a quiet, faceless name. Something corporate and dull, just another cog in the industry, and I used that shell to start approaching Harwood Timber's secondary suppliers, the small mills and regional shipping partners who never made the Christmas card list but kept the company running on the margins. And I offered them better rates, faster payments, cleaner terms, told them we had investors, a niche corner of the market looking to compete quietly, nothing flashy, just smart logistics and guaranteed contracts. And in less than 90 days, Ironwood Consulting began siphoning the veins of Harwood Timber's infrastructure without raising a single alarm, because the mills didn't care about loyalty, they cared about cash, and Danny didn't even know they existed. He was too busy posing in photo ops and trying to brand us as eco-forward on LinkedIn. And by the time Q2 rolled around, our fulfillment rate was lagging, our shipping costs were climbing, and Danny was holding emergency meetings trying to figure out why trucks weren't showing up on time, why orders were backlogged, why clients were whispering about better service somewhere else. And I sat in those meetings like a stone, offering mild suggestions and supportive nods while inside I savored every crack in the foundation, every sign that the machine was starting to falter under his clueless hands. And my father, well, he noticed, of course he did. He wasn't stupid. He saw the decline and started leaning on Danny harder, started snapping in board meetings and sending me quiet emails late at night that reeked of unspoken desperation, asking if I had thoughts on how to support the new leadership or stabilize operations, and I answered every one of them like a good soldier, brief, professional, helpful, non-committal, because the more he leaned on me, the more he would depend on me when it all came apart, and then I would have leverage, real leverage, the kind that turns kings into puppets. But before that could happen, I needed more than disruption. I needed to bleed them dry, not just financially but symbolically, and that's when I remembered the Harwood Reserve. 200 acres of untouched forest on the outskirts of town, property my grandfather bought in 1961, land my father swore would never be sold, a testament to the family's stewardship and legacy. But I also knew something else, something critical. I knew Danny had debt, serious debt, because I'd followed the breadcrumbs, tracked the payments from his personal accounts to a series of sketchy crypto platforms and startup angel funds that crashed within months. And I knew he'd gone to our father to ask for a loan, knew he'd been denied, knew he'd come to me, slurred and desperate, after too many drinks at a corporate function, saying, "You know, if we sold the reserve, we could fix all this." And that's when I planted the idea, not directly, but through whispers, through a planted phone call from a former classmate who now worked in real estate acquisitions, who posed as an outside investor interested in developing sustainable retreats and asked my father if Harwood Timber had ever considered selling any of its unused land, especially that beautiful, untouched forest just 20 minutes from downtown. And it worked, because greed and desperation are louder than legacy when you're drowning. And soon the conversation started behind closed doors, my father resisting, Danny pushing, and just as they reached an impasse, I discovered a zoning update from the city that would triple the value of the land if sold now, a zoning UPDA. That didn't exist, by the way, just a fabricated PDF and a few emails sent from a fake city planner account I set up using an old domain I registered in college, and it tipped the scales, because now the land wasn't just a solution. It was a gold mine, and my father, always the pragmatist, finally gave in, reluctantly, and signed off on the sale, never knowing that the buyer, an LLC named West Green Holdings, was just another mask on my Ironwood empire. And when the papers were signed and the deed transferred, I flipped the land immediately to a conservation trust for twice the price, locking it up from development forever and cashing a check with more zeros than any bonus I'd ever seen. And when the press got wind of the sale, when local reporters started asking why the Harwoods would betray their grandfather's legacy for a quick buck, I made sure the internal memo I forged leaked to the media, one suggesting that Danny had pushed for the sale to resolve certain financial obligations and reposition the company in a more liquid market. And my father was livid, blindsided, humiliated, and Danny tried to spin it, tried to claim it was a misunderstanding, that the memo was taken out of context, but the damage was done. The board was furious, investors jittery, and inside the company, morale collapsed overnight. The old guard saw it as betrayal. The new hires saw it as chaos. And I sat at the eye of the storm with clean hands and a calm smile, because they still thought I was the only one who could hold this thing together. And that's when my father finally came to me. 3 weeks after the news broke, after the protests, after the cancellation of 2 major contracts, after the shareholder meeting where our stock took a 14% nosedive in a single day. He came to me not as a father, but as a CEO, a desperate man in a sinking ship. And he said, "Michael, I need your help." And I said, "Of course," and I meant it, because I wasn't finished yet. Not even close. I was just getting started. The day my father sat in my office with his ego cracked and his voice dry was the day I knew the tides had shifted for good. Because for the first time in my life, Charles Harwood didn't speak to me like a commander addressing a subordinate. He spoke like a man trying to hide the fact that he was already knee-deep in quicksand. And the more he moved, the faster he sank. He didn't say he was wrong. He didn't apologize. He just said, "Michael, I need your help stabilizing things." And I smiled. Like a good soldier, nodded like a loyal son. But inside I could already hear the glass shattering. Because this wasn't just about the business anymore. It wasn't even about the land or the headlines or the angry shareholders. This was about legacy. About a man who had spent his whole life pretending he was invincible, now realizing he had handed the kingdom to a fool and the keys to the vault to the one person he'd spent years belittling. And so I leaned in and asked, "What exactly do you want me to do?" And he said, "Help Danny with the operational mess. Work with the suppliers, calm the board. Make this look like a transition issue, not a leadership failure." And I said, "Of course, I'll do whatever's needed." But what I actually did was much more precise, much more permanent. I began collecting things, hard things, real things, undeniable things, because tearing a man's reputation apart requires evidence, not emotion, and the mistake most people make in revenge is that they go for blood too early. But I wasn't looking for pain. I was looking for ruin. So I hired a private firm under another alias and had them audit every vendor deal Danny had touched since joining the company, every bonus he'd authorized, every expense report he'd signed. And I found exactly what I expected. Kickbacks disguised as consulting fees, promotional budgets routed to third-party accounts tied to marketing contractors that didn't exist, flights billed as business that led to hotel rooms in Vegas, cash advances with no reconciliations. It was all there, a slow siphon of corporate funds fueled by entitlement and stupidity, and it was exactly what I needed. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. I needed more. I needed the family to see it, the board to feel it, the press to taste it. And so I waited while I staged the next blow. Exposure, and it came during a quarterly investor meeting, where the board gathered in our flagship conference room overlooking the river, and the mood was tense, the kind of tension that clings to your collar and makes water taste like whiskey. And my father was doing his best to play damage control, spinning stories about volatile markets and external logistical challenges. And Danny sat there, pale and fidgety, with a stack of charts he barely understood and a script he'd rehearsed with an intern, and just before they could move to Q&A, I raised my hand. A small thing, a simple gesture, but it hit the room like a fire alarm, and I said, "Before we move on, I'd like to share something with the board," and my father's eyes flicked toward me, narrowed, but he said nothing, so I connected my laptop to the main screen and pulled up a file titled Expenditures and Irregularities, Harwood Timber Q1, Q3, and the moment the first slide appeared, a summary of funds misappropriated by Danny Harwood totaling just over $1.8 million. The silence in that room turned from awkward to lethal. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just presented, invoice by invoice, vendor by vendor, each transaction paired with its corresponding audit trail, and when I was done, I closed my laptop and said, "I believe this board deserves transparency if we're to rebuild investor confidence," and the room didn't erupt. It didn't need to, because the silence that followed was the sound of a dynasty buckling, a legacy unraveling. And when my father finally found his voice, it came out hoarse, trembling. "Where did you get this?" And I said, "Does it matter?" And the chairman of the board, a man who had known my grandfather, turned to me and said, "Can you prepare a report and action plan within 48 hours? And I nodded, and Danny stormed out, muttering about sabotage and lies and legal action, and my father just sat there, staring at the screen like it had spoken a language he didn't understand. And that night, I knew the walls were closing in, because for men like my father, image was everything, and I had just torn the mask off in front of the people who mattered most. But I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot, because now that the damage was public, I needed to make it permanent, and that required control, full, legal, airtight control. So I met with our general counsel under the pretense of crisis management and floated the idea of an executive reshuffle, citing investor pressure and reputational risk, and to my surprise, the idea wasn't met with resistance, it was met with relief, because no one wanted to stand by the man who appointed a thief to run the company and watched him burn it down, and within a week, the board voted to strip Danny of all executive authority pending investigation, and my father, seeing the writing on the wall, offered to step down to avoid distraction, and I gave a speech about the need for fresh leadership rooted in discipline and legacy. And they named me interim CEO effective immediately, and that's when the tide became a flood, because with that title came access to everything: internal records, pending lawsuits, confidential memos, and the private emails my father thought he deleted, including one where he referred to me as a temporary solution, not a long-term fit, and that one I saved, printed, and framed on the wall of my new office, right above the chair where he used to sit, and while the media speculated, while Danny posted cryptic rants online and our stock slowly recovered under my direction, I made one more move, one final, precise incision that would cut deeper than any of them could imagine. I called a contact at the state attorney general's office and handed over the audit, not anonymously, not quietly, but formally, with a cover letter signed as CEO of Harwood Timber, and within days, an investigation was opened into corporate fraud, misuse of funds, and financial misconduct, with Danny Harwood and Charles Harwood named as primary subjects. And when my father called me, for the first time in weeks, I didn't answer. I let it ring until voicemail, and when I played the message later, it was his voice but not the one I remembered. Not commanding, not condescending, it was tired, thin, almost pleading. He said, "Michael, I know we've had our differences, but you need to understand, if this goes public, everything we built, everything your grandfather started, it's gone." And I listened to that message 3 times, then deleted it, because the truth is, it was already gone. He just didn't realize I wasn't trying to save the legacy, I was rewriting it, and in this version, the last name still mattered. But only one first name survived, mine. The moment the Attorney General's office confirmed the investigation had begun, I felt something I hadn't felt since the night my father humiliated me in front of our entire family. Peace, not joy, not triumph, not satisfaction. Just a stillness in my chest, like the air before a storm passes, like I had finally climbed out of the hole they buried me in and stood on the edge of something vast, something final. And in that moment, I understood that revenge wasn't a fire or a scream or a headline. It was a whisper, a steady hand, a room full of men watching everything they built start to unravel one comma at a time. And now that the law was involved, now that subpoenas were being drafted and depositions scheduled, I could step back and watch the tide take them. Because I had already won the war they didn't know they were in, but I wasn't done yet, because winning wasn't enough. Not for what they took from me, not for the years I spent being the quiet one, the reliable one, the shadow behind the throne who never asked for anything because I believed that one day I'd be recognized without having to scream for it. But that day never came, and so I stopped waiting. And now I had control, total, legal, operational control, over Harwood Timber, and I didn't waste a second. I restructured the board, brought in 2 outside directors with reputations for corporate turnaround, terminated our bloated consulting contracts, renegotiated logistics deals, closed 2 underperforming mills, and reinvested in automation. And within 6 weeks, the numbers turned green again, the headlines shifted from scandal to stability, and my inbox was full of cautious congratulations from people who had ignored me for years. But the calls that meant the most were the ones that didn't come. My father didn't call again, not after the investigation launched, and Danny disappeared completely. No texts, no calls, just silence. The kind of silence that used to suffocate me but now felt like breathing room. And in that silence, I found space to finally think about the future, not the future they planned for me, but the one I would build with my own name on the masthead, because Harwood Timber was still their name, still their legacy. And I didn't want to inherit ashes. I wanted to found something new. So I created a new division, quietly, called it Redwood Solutions, positioned it as a modern logistics consultancy, and began spinning off operations under that brand. So that when the storm finally collapsed the old house, I'd already be living in a new one with steel beams and bulletproof glass. And while I was doing that, the investigation dragged my family through the mud publicly. Danny was served first, outside his new apartment in Miami, his face pale and bloated in the leaked photos, trying to hide behind sunglasses as agents handed him the envelope. And 2 days later, my father was summoned to give a deposition, a private one at first, then another in front of a closed door panel. And though the charges weren't criminal yet, the word fraud was being whispered louder, and suddenly all those people who once toasted him at country clubs stopped returning his calls, sponsors pulled out of events, donations dried up, and my mother, who had always stayed silent, who had always nodded when he spoke and looked away when I looked at her, called me for the first time in months, her voice brittle and small. "Michael, what's happening?" And I almost hung up, almost said nothing, but something in her tone made me pause, and I said, "What's happening is accountability." And she whispered, "He's not eating, he's not sleeping." And I said, "Neither did I, for years," and then I hung up, because I didn't know her comfort. Not after the dinners where she watched him dismiss me like an intern, not after the birthdays she spent praising Danny's ambitions and ignoring my achievements. And a week later, she sent me a letter, not an email, not a voicemail, but an actual letter, handwritten on thick paper with her old monogram, and it said, simply, "I'm sorry. I knew you deserved more." I was afraid of him too, and I stared at that letter for a long time, not because I forgave her, but because it was the first time anyone in that house had said I was right. And I put it in a drawer, didn't reply, just kept it like a relic, a fragment of something broken that used to mean home. And meanwhile, the media began circling closer, rumors of formal charges, leaked documents, anonymous sources confirming that Danny had used corporate funds to prop up gambling debts, and my father had signed off on it to protect the family name. And even though I didn't leak anything directly, I made sure the truth was always within reach, always hovering just close enough for someone else to find it, because I didn't want to destroy them with a bullet. I wanted to leave the gun on the table and let them pull the trigger themselves, and they did, again and again. Every denial, every evasive statement, every clumsy attempt at spin made them look worse. And while the legacy of Charles Harwood disintegrated on evening news segments and business blogs, I bought out the last of the minority shareholders, quietly, methodically, until I held the majority stake, and with it, I filed the paperwork to delist Harwood Timber from the public exchange and reclassify it under Redwood Holdings, where the new board was composed entirely of people I trusted, engineers, analysts, not politicians or family friends. And when the transaction cleared, the Harwood name disappeared from the building, from the website, from the business cards, and in its place was mine, Michael Redwood, CEO, founder, owner of the company that was once supposed to be my inheritance, now rebuilt as my creation. And I threw a small event, just a soft launch, only about 50 people, local press, partners, new employees, and I gave a speech, simple, calm, no theatrics, and I said, "Sometimes legacy is a wall that keeps you out. Sometimes it's a door you have to burn down to build something better. And the applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It wasn't explosive, but it was real. And I stood there under the lights, no family in sight, no father to interrupt me, no brother to steal the spotlight. And for the first time, I wasn't a shadow in someone else's empire. I was the architect of my own. The last time I saw my father, he was sitting alone on a bench outside a courthouse, gray suit hanging from his shoulders like it belonged to someone else. His eyes sunken, hands trembling slightly as he folded and unfolded a tissue he never used. And for a long moment I stood across the street just watching him, not with hate, not even with satisfaction, but with the kind of cold detachment you feel when looking at an abandoned building that once seemed too big to fall. And I thought about the man he used to be, the commanding presence, the booming voice, the sharp glare that could freeze a room, and how all of that had drained out of him like air from a punctured tire. And part of me wondered if I should walk away, leave him there like he left me at that dinner table when he told the world I wasn't worthy, but I didn't. I crossed the street slowly, deliberately, and when I stopped in front of him, he looked up, and I saw something in his eyes I never expected to see from Charles. Harwood. Shame. Real shame. Not the performative kind, but the sort that crawls out from your ribs when there's no one left to blame. And he didn't speak right away, just nodded once and motioned to the bench beside him. And I sat down, not out of kindness, but because it was time to end it properly, to close the loop. And he said, "They're going to make an example of me." And I replied, "They should." And he didn't argue. He just nodded again. And for a long time we sat in silence, the kind of silence that used to crush me, but now just felt like proof of how far I'd come. And finally he said, "You were always better than him." And I said, "That's the first honest thing you've ever said to me." And he laughed, a short, sad sound, like a man realizing too late that honesty is worthless when it's buried under decades of power games and pride. And he looked at me and said, "I thought I was protecting the company." And I turned to him, eyes steady, and said, "No, you were protecting yourself from me." And he didn't deny it, just looked away like the truth was a weight too heavy to carry anymore. And then he asked the question I had waited my entire life to hear. "Why didn't you walk away? You had every reason to leave, to start fresh." And I said, "Because walking away lets people like you keep telling the story." And he swallowed hard, lips pressed together, and I could see in his face that he finally understood, not just the cost of what he'd done, but the magnitude of what I'd become. And I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and said, "This isn't your company anymore." It never really was. It was always built on other people's backs, Grandpa's hands, the workers' sweat, and my silence. And he said nothing, just nodded slowly, and I added, "You told me I'd inherit nothing, and you were right." And for a second he looked confused until I leaned down, close enough for only him to hear, and said, "Because I didn't inherit any of this. I took it." And then I walked away, didn't look back, didn't pause, just kept walking until the courthouse was behind me and the man who once held my future in his palm was nothing more than a broken silhouette in a world he no longer controlled. And 2 weeks later, the charges became public: misuse of corporate funds, financial fraud, obstruction of fiduciary duty. Danny's name was dragged through every headline. And while my father was spared criminal prosecution due to his age and health, the civil penalties were staggering: millions in fines, assets frozen, pension slashed, legacy obliterated. And I made sure the story wasn't buried. I made sure every outlet understood the real headline. Harwood empire falls from within. CEO's son dismantles family dynasty. And for the first time in my life, people knew the truth. Not the version my father curated over decades of backroom deals and dinner speeches, but the raw, unflinching truth of who built this company, who saved it, who rebuilt it from the ashes. And I rebranded it publicly. Rolled out Redwood Holdings with a full campaign, billboard spots, community grants, environmental partnerships. And people didn't just respect it, they admired it. Because I didn't just take the throne, I made it mine. But here's the part most people never talk about when they fantasize about revenge. They forget that after the fire dies down, after the ruins settle, after the applause fades, there's still the question of what you're going to do with the silence. And mine came fast, not with regret but with weight. The realization that I was now the architect of a future that could no longer be blamed on anyone else. And so I worked harder than I ever had, longer than I thought I could, not because I needed to prove anything to anyone, but because I needed to prove it to myself. that I wasn't just the son who outplayed his father, but a man who could build something worthy of his own name. And as Redwood Holdings grew, as the numbers soared and new branches opened and the name became a symbol of precision and resilience, I found myself at peace, not every day, not every hour, but in those moments where legacy used to feel like a cage and now felt like a blueprint I had drawn from scratch. And then, one night, almost a year to the day from the dinner where it all began, I got a call from my mother, and she said, "He's sick," and I knew what she meant. And I knew she didn't call to ask for help, just to inform me like a headline. And I thanked her and hung up, didn't ask for details, didn't offer sympathy, because some wounds don't bleed anymore. They just leave a scar that itches when the weather changes, and 2 months later, he died quietly, at home, no press release, no state funeral, just a death certificate and a probate notice that meant nothing to me. And when they asked if I wanted to say anything at the service, I said no, because the only eulogy I ever gave him was the one I wrote in action and strategy, in every contract I outmaneuvered, in every deal I closed, and every time I was called sir by the same people who once shook his hand. And when I stood outside the cemetery and watched them lower the casket, I didn't cry, didn't pray, didn't even linger. I just whispered, "I hope you're watching," and walked back to the black car waiting to take me to a board meeting where I was about to announce a $400 million expansion deal. And that's the truth. Revenge didn't feel like fireworks or confetti. It felt like clarity. Like standing in your own skin for the first time and knowing it fits. And if there's one thing I want people to understand from all this, it's that power isn't something you're handed. It's something you claim when no one's looking, when they've counted you out, when they've laughed in your face at a family dinner and said you'll get nothing, and you smile, and you walk out, and you build something so large, so undeniable, so brilliantly calculated that by the time they realize what you've done, it's already over, and all that's left is for them to sit in the rubble while you sign the deed.